Hi everyone, our project is on malaria infections in African countries.
For our project, we chose to analyze data about malaria to learn more about which factors impact cases and mortality rates. Although malaria is not as widely spread as it is now, millions of people are still affected by it. In 2010, malaria caused over 200 million cases. African countries face one of the highest rates of malaria, which is why it is important to focus on those countries. Malaria research analysis is important as understanding malaria is essential to many countries as more service personnel can be dispatched at higher rates if malaria is still prevalent.
So methods. So for this, we found 3 separate data sets online that contained information about malaria in different African countries. To answer our research questions about factors that impact malaria case numbers, death numbers, and mortality rates, we cleaned and merged all these data sets into one. So then using that merged data set, we challenged ourselves to use a new library called Plotly Express to create data visualizations that are interactive. And using these interactive graphs with mouse over, we were able to view statistics for each country on malaria factors, cases, and deaths.
For our first research question, we want to see if countries with a high rural population, over 50%, have a higher mortality rate. We investigated the difference between countries with majority rural versus urban populations and calculated the mortality rates. For each country, we wanted to see if a country with a majority rural population has a high or a low mortality rate. The results for this question have shown that there is no clear correlation between countries being more rural and having higher mortality rate, as some countries have high rural percentage and low mortality rate, and or countries have a high urban percentage and high mortality rate.
Our second question asked how the number of cases and how the number of deaths due to malaria have changed over time. So we answered this by creating 2 separate graphs. The left one shows cases by country and the right shows deaths by country between the years 2000 and 2017. The results showed that the number of malaria cases continue to increase every year in almost every country. But the good news is the number of people dying from malaria is decreasing, with the exception of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which means that even though cases are rising, medical care and access are improving to lower the mortality rate over time.
Our next research question was to see if countries with a higher percentage of women that have received intermittent preventive treatment, IPT, have a lower mortality rate. We investigated the difference between malaria mortality rates between countries with a higher percentage of women that have received intermittent preventive treatment, IPT, which is a treatment given to pregnant women to prevent malaria episodes in infants, and see if the treatment affects the mortality rate. The goal of this graph is to understand if the treatment helps to lower the mortality rate. The result of our analysis shows that on average, countries that have a higher percentage of women that received that treatment have on average lower mortality rate.
And our final question asks if countries with higher percentages of rural populations have a lower percentage of women that have received IPT. So this graph shows the percentage of people living in rural areas for each country and is color-coded by the percentage of pregnant women who received this anti-malarial medication. The goal of the graph was to look at medical access. We wanted to see if there was a correlation between how rural a country is and how many women received the medicine, but our results show no clear correlation between the 2 variables. Our key takeaways for the project, one of the main statistics we looked at was the percentage of pregnant women who received IPT, which is the intermittent preventative treatment for a high-risk group like pregnant women. This really showed us the importance of medical access and quality of medical care across both rural and urban regions. And another key point that we found was thinking about how malaria might impact Africa in the future due to climate change.
So for future studies, I just want to quickly talk about the early stages of our project, where we intended to answer questions about geographic distribution of malaria, including how mosquito distributions might correlate to malaria distributions. So we just weren't able to do this because we didn't have enough data, but we would definitely consider doing this in the future. Something we also want to look at is how climate change, specifically temperature changes, kind of like Jen mentioned, would affect mosquito populations and therefore malaria cases.